Good afternoon. Welcome to this session. Uh, we have with us Mr. S. Subramanian, who would be Mr. Subramanian is professor and ICSSR National Fellow at Madras Institute of Development Studies. And his research includes aspects of social and economic measurement with specific reference to poverty, inequality, discrimination, and demographic indicators. So today, it's really great to have him over here. But at the outset, let me also thanks International Growth Center, its country director, Mr. Ajay Mukherjee, co-country director, Mr. Saibal Gupta, for giving this opportunity. Want to hear such distinguished guest, scholarly Mr. Subramanian, and giving us all this opportunity to have to interact with him during the question-answer session. This also gives opportunity to interact not only the researcher, the academician from the various field, and also the administrator. I mean, it also gives opportunity to interact people who are from the administration like us. And we have with us over here Mr. Gangwar, the Principal Secretary to Honorable Chief Minister. So this gives an opportunity to interact, all of us, share our views. With this introduction, and as we all know that today's topic, distinguished guests, are that very, very relevant in today's context, especially the issue of growth and issue of inequality with the growth is a very, very relevant today, more than ever before. There are a lot of issues we do deliberate that growth is very, very essential to wipe out poverty, to reduce the inequality in the society in economic terms. But at the same time, there are other schools who believe that as we are growing, as we are faster growing, the inequity and then the inequality in the society is also widening. So there are two divergent views, and so it will be nice that we'll be hearing from Mr. Subramanian on this issue. And with this brief introduction, I invite Mr. Subramanian to address the distinguished gatherings out here.
For inviting me to present this lecture, I must thank Professor Ajay Mukherjee, my admired senior colleague. Although it's possible, as Professor Chatterjee pointed out earlier in the morning, that he might have made a mistake, in which case, again, you will prefer all your complaints to him. He's accountable. Right, so what I'm going to be doing today is to present a few thoughts on the subject of the allegations of inclusive growth, which have been visited, inclusive economic growth, which have been visited on India. As you're all aware, the notion of inclusiveness has figured in one way or another in many of the stated intents and purposes of the government. So we have had references in successive plan documents and economic surveys and so on to inclusive growth, to growth with social justice, to growth with distribution, and to pro-poor growth. And most recently, and most especially in the 11th and the 12th plan documents, the reference has been, the new catchword is inclusive growth. And these expressions are so much in currency that I think it is generally expected that when you encounter this term in the economic survey or in plan documents, you're not really expected to take it seriously. And to do so might actually be somewhat unadult and naive. But it occurred to me to ask, what if one actually took this seriously? And ask the question of how inclusive growth has actually been in India. So this is the problem to which I address myself. And in the course of dealing with this problem, I shall resort to some very naive arithmetic, some very elementary arithmetic. But since we are supposed to be a tribe of calculators and sophistas, I don't think I'll be frustrating any expectations by doing that. Fine. Now, some years ago when I actually set myself up to examine this question, I found that there wasn't a great deal of help which was available from the literature on how to actually conceptualize the notion of inclusive growth. And then it occurred to me that there were, however, certain strands of the literature which were apparently unconnected with the notion of inclusive growth, which might, however, nevertheless have a bearing on how one might approach this problem. Now, I was thinking in particular of what is known as a Talmudic estate problem. And the problem is the following one. This has been dealt with in the Talmud. And the problem revolves around a person who dies and leaves behind an estate which is not large enough to cover the various debts which he has incurred. So the question arises, what is the best possible way of repatriating these debts to the various creditors? Now, various solutions to this problem have been suggested, some of which are actually available in the Talmud. The most egalitarian way in which you might wish to address this problem is to reduce the largest debt to the size of the next largest debt and to ask if the estate has been exhausted in the process. If it hasn't, then you take the two largest debts and reduce those to the size of the third largest debt and then ask the same question again. And you keep on doing that until you come to that marginal creditor with whom the budget or the estate gets exhausted. Now, a little bit of thought will tell you that this is essentially an application of what is known as the Maximin Rawlsian principle of justice. Okay. A less egalitarian outcome would simply be to repatriate the debt in proportion to the sizes of the debts which have been incurred by the various creditors. And you can have an entire spectrum of more or less egalitarian solutions to this problem, but surely the least egalitarian of all of the solutions that you can think of is one in which you resort to the simple expedient of just dividing up the available estate equally among the various creditors. Now that satisfies the requirement that of two creditors, the larger of the two creditors never gets a smaller share of the estate. A similar set of problems is available from a consideration of what is called optimal budgetary intervention and poverty alleviation schemes, where the analytical structure of the problem is very similar to the Talmudic estate problem. And it consists of the following. We are told that we have a budget which is not large enough to raise all the poor to the poverty line. And the question is, how would you best allocate this budget in order to maximally reduce poverty? Of course, this would depend upon your objective function. And again, you can think of alternative solutions, one of which is extremely egalitarian in its approach, would consist in raising the poorest person's income to the level of the next poorest person, ascertaining if the budget has been exhausted. If it hasn't, then you raise the incomes of the two poorest persons to the income of the third poorest person and carry on through the sequence of progressive and income equalizing transfers until you arrive at that marginal unit or person with whom the budget gets exhausted. This again is a version of the Rawlsian lexicographic Maximin rule. Or you could divide the budget in proportion to the shortfall of each person's income from the poverty line. So this is another version of the proportionality rule, which is less egalitarian than the earlier one. Again, the least egalitarian of all egalitarian solutions that you can think of would simply consist in dividing up the budget equally among all the claimants for it. Now, what does any of this have to do with conceptualizing inclusive growth? Actually, quite a lot. Because simply transposing the structure of this problem to the one which confronts us now, one can ask the following question. Supposing you have experienced a certain amount of growth in per capita income, the question is, how do you best allocate this incremental income amongst the various contenders for it? And again, the least egalitarian of various egalitarian solutions that you can think of would consist in ensuring that everybody continues to receive their present levels of consumption expenditure, and after you have allowed for that, you just divide up whatever surplus is left equally among everybody. So this presumably is the most conservative egalitarian solution that you can think of to the problem of securing a measure of egalitarianism in the distribution of the product of growth. Now, to see what the experience of India has been in respect of this problem, what my colleague Jairaj and I did was to conduct this following simple experiment. We looked at consumption expenditure data for India from 1983 up to 2009-10 on the basis of information which is available in the National Sample Surveys Office's quinquennial surveys. And we performed the following simple exercise. We took the lowest quintile, that is to say the poorest 20% of the population, and the richest quintile. And for each of these quintiles, we took 1983 as the base year and 2009-10 as the terminal year. And by applying the equal division rule, we found out what the level of consumption expenditure ought to be in the terminal year for each of these quintiles for it to satisfy this equal division rule. Okay, and once you've done that, then you can find out what the warranted rate of growth of consumption should be. And if you apply these warranted rates of growth to the different points of time at which you have NSSO sample data, you can get the warranted levels of consumption expenditure in each of the intermediate years. So what you then have is two time series, and time series on warranted levels of consumption expenditure, i.e. those levels of consumption expenditure which would conform with an equal division of the product of growth, which, to repeat, is the most conservative sort of egalitarian rule that you can think of. And then you, of course, have data on the actual levels of consumption expenditure which have been experienced by each of these quintiles in each of the years for which we have data. Now, if growth has been reasonably egalitarian, you would expect that the warranted and the actual levels of consumption expenditure from year to year must coincide. In other words, if you took the ratio of the actual to the warranted level of consumption expenditure, it should be exactly equal to 1 as you move forward in time. But what's been the actual experience? The curve on top, this is for rural India, tells you the path which has been described by the richest decile, and the curve at the bottom tells you the path which has been described by the poorest quintile. So not only is the magnitude for the richest quintile everywhere in excess of unity, and that of the poorest quintile everywhere in deficit of unity, but you find that the gap between them assumes the form of a diverging fork. You get a similar picture for the urban areas. You get a not dissimilar picture if you were to replace the poorest and the richest quintiles with the below median and the above median population. That's for the rural areas, and this is for the urban areas. So what one finds is a pattern of growth on the basis of these figures, which I would submit have been generated on the strength of a reasonably reasonable conception of inclusive growth. What we find is a picture of the very opposite of what you might think of as being reasonable. Now, fortunately, I did this exercise before I actually looked seriously at the applied literature in India. And when I did that, I found that the results that I was getting were quite different from what several experts have actually pronounced. So I will just read quickly some of the assertions here in increasing order of assertiveness, which have been made by commentators on the Indian economy. T.N. Srinivasan, for example, in a paper written in 2013, says that no statistically significant difference between the Lorenz curves over time is seen in either rural or urban areas. He does say, however, with a certain measure of caution, that his statistical tests on Lorenz curves and CDFs and so on have not necessarily established rigorously that in India, in the decade of the 2000s, inequality has not changed. But by and large, the impression he gives us that he finds it puzzling that in the popular perception, inequality has been seen to have increased over time in India. Ahluwalia, writing in 2011, says, rising inequality has been an issue in many industrialized countries and also emerging market countries such as China. Inequality is normally discussed in terms of inequality of incomes, but since we don't have systematic data on income distribution, but only data on the distribution of consumption expenditure, he finds that available data, quote, show that there was a modest increase in inequality in urban areas, though no similar trend can be discerned in rural areas. Jagdish Bhagwati, speaking in 2011, and he's making a comment on allegations of increasing inequality which have been made by the writer Pankaj Mishra. He's commenting on that. He says, while economic analysis can often produce a yawning indifference, and Mishra's narrative is by contrast eloquent and captivating, the latter is really fiction masquerading as non-fiction. The fact is that several analyses show that the enhanced growth rate has been good for reducing poverty, while it has not increased inequality measured meaningfully. He doesn't, of course, tell us how inequality is to be measured meaningfully, but I'll try and make some noises about that, and it'll, in fact, constitute the crux of my discussion this afternoon. Surjit Bhalla in 2011 says, among other things, that often in the polemical debate about poverty and policy, and the poverty of policy, the facts unfortunately become irrelevant. What is revealing is that to date there has been little variation in real inequality in India. While comparative data need to be explored, it is likely the case that this near constancy is unusual given the buzz of the conventional wisdom that inequality increases with growth and or that Indian inequality has sharply worsened. So you see, received wisdom is in fairly striking contrast with findings which I thought I had established with a measure of confidence about what's actually been happening to consumption expenditure inequality in India. So it became important to try and identify the source of this difficulty, and after all, not all of these commentators are primarily TV personalities. So I suppose we should take some of these statements more rather than less seriously. So what is the source of the difference between the kinds of results which I get and the sorts of results which are a product of received wisdom? And it occurred to me then that actually I was revisiting a very old problem which had been examined by the economic theorist Serge Christophe Combe in the early 1970s, and which has unhappily simply fallen by the wayside now, apart from occasional revisitations of this problem in some narrow, arcane area of axiomatic inequality measurement. What was the point which Combe made? Writing in 1973, and this he did shortly after the turbulent period which France went through, when there was a huge labor strike, eventually the matter was settled by the labor unions accepting an across-the-board increase of something like 13% in all wages. And it was only after this proposal was implemented that they recognized that 13% on 100 francs is a good deal different from 13% on 1,000 francs. And that there was a certain sense in which inequality had actually widened as a result of their capitulating to what seemed to, on the face of it, to be an attractive offer. So investigating this problem more deeply, Combe said that it is a feature of virtually all known measures of inequality that they satisfy what is called the scale invariance property. Now, scale invariance simply says that measured inequality ought not to be sensitive to equiproportionate increases in incomes. So if you double everybody's income, then inequality, which is scale invariant, will not change. It will remain the same. So Combe said, I mean, why is this rule sacred? We might equally have another axiom, which he called translation invariance, which requires the inequality measure to be invariant with respect not to equiproportionate changes, but to equal absolute increases in everybody's income. Okay? So he says, if you add 100 rupees to everybody's income, then we will take the line that inequality has not changed. Now, for obvious reasons, Combe called scale invariant indices, which are the kinds of indices which are in common currency, he called these rightist inequality measures. And he called translation invariant inequality indices leftist measures. Now, I don't have the time, and it's probably not a particularly gripping subject, but there are problems of both logical coherence and normative appeal with both scale invariant indices and with translation invariant indices. So there is probably a case for pitching our values not at either polar extreme, but somewhere in between. And this led to the evolution of what Combe called intermediate or centrist measures of inequality, which are essentially measures of inequality which have the following property. They register an increase when everybody's income is increased in the same proportion, and they register a decline when everybody's income is increased by the same absolute amount. So what you tend to do is to combine the virtues of relative measures and of absolute measures with a view to mitigating the effects of their separate vices. And this will lead to a class of indices, which, as I said, are called intermediate or centrist indices of inequality. And I think I have said enough to justify the importance of importing centrist or intermediate measures of inequality more and more as we go along into mainstream analysis. Because what we are doing otherwise is simply loading our values while seeming to be free of, devoid of any normative engagement with the problem when we systematically measure inequality only in terms of relative measures. Of course, the same would go for measuring inequality only in terms of absolute measures. By the way, we are all of us familiar with both absolute and relative measures of inequality. The most commonly employed measure of absolute inequality is what we are all very familiar with as the standard deviation, okay, or the variance. The standard deviation is just a square root of the variance. And a very well-known relative measure of inequality is the coefficient of variation, which is just the standard deviation deflated by the mean of a distribution, so that you make the inequality measure mean independent of the units of measurement. Now, so what we need then in order to be able to take a view of what's been actual inequality is to move away from the computation of inequality measures, which are either completely relative or completely absolute. What we need are intermediate measures. Do they exist? Yes, they do. There were a number of intermediate measures which were proposed by Combe himself and then subsequently by two researchers called Bossert and Pfingsten. But a difficulty with all of these measures has been that they do not satisfy the property of unit consistency, which is the following property. Now, it ought not to matter whether you're measuring inequality in dollars or in rupees. Okay, now if you get a certain result when you measure inequality in terms of dollars, which is different from the result that you get when you measure income in rupees, then that is cause for concern prima facie at first blush. That's not a nice property to have, and this perhaps explains, apart from the implicit ideological tilt, this perhaps explains technically why, by and large, it is only relative measures which have been favored in the literature, because relative measures are unit-free. They do not depend upon the units in which income is measured. Now, an economist called Cheng said that the requirement of invariance of the value of the measure with respect to the units of measurement is probably an unnecessarily strong cardinal requirement, and could be replaced by a weaker ordinal requirement, which simply requires that if you have two distributions X and Y, and you find that X has more inequality than Y when income is measured in dollars, then you should ensure that this ranking of X above Y is not reversed when you measure income in rupees rather than in dollars. So what you need is the preservation of the rankings of distributions rather than precisely the values of the inequality measures themselves. So that's vital, because if you don't have unit consistency, the whole exercise of inequality measurement can just end up being incoherent. Of course, it would also help if the inequality measure were to be decomposable, by which is meant that it's an attractive property of an inequality measure if you can neatly separate out the amount of inequality that you can attribute to inequality within groups and the amount of inequality that you can attribute to inequality between groups, so that you're also enabled to undertake not just vertical or interpersonal differences in income, but also horizontal or intergroup differences in income. Now it looks like a tall order. You need a measure of inequality which is neither relative nor absolute, but is intermediate. Furthermore, it is required to be unit consistent, and furthermore, it would help if it were also decomposable. Do there exist any such inequality measures? This was left to, I don't know how to pronounce his name, because it seems to lack all the crucial vowels. The spelling is Krtscha, so I'll just call him Kritcha, who is a mathematician who in 1994 wrote a paper in which he advanced a measure of inequality, an intermediate measure of inequality, which has since been verified to be the only unit consistent, decomposable, centrist measure of inequality which is available. So in a sense, the problem of choice is taken care of by the fact that this is the only index which satisfies all of these desirable properties. Now, what is the Kritcha index? What it does is the following. Supposing you have a distribution X and you have another distribution of incomes Y, and that there has been an increase in the average income in moving from distribution X to distribution Y. What he suggests we do in order to get a persuasive notion of intermediate invariance, what he suggests we do is the following. Take the first incremental unit of income and divide it into two equal halves. The first half you allocate amongst the various people in the society that you're dealing with in accordance with the distribution of income which currently obtains. Okay, that is to say, in accordance with the present proportions. The other one half you just divide equally among the various people. Okay, and if you do that, you are taken to a new distribution. Now, starting with this new distribution as the reference distribution, take the second unit of income and perform exactly the same operation. And you move on to a third distribution. Using the third distribution as your new reference distribution, you repeat this, and you keep on repeating this operation until the differences in the two means have been exhausted. Okay. So what you are doing is essentially performing an operation which meets with his description of his measure of inequality. He calls it a fair compromise inequality measure. And that's exactly what it is. You're giving equal weight to both the relative and the absolute conceptions of inequality by resort to this continuous expedient of half-half splits of every incremental unit of income, with one half being allocated according to the existing proportions and one half being allocated equally. And the question he asked is, subject to a few plausible conditions, what is the class of inequality indices which will actually trace this inequality invariant path? And he came up with a characterization which has since been called the Kritcha inequality index. I won't put it up because it's going to be of no help to anybody to know exactly what it looks like in terms of the symbols which are involved. But as it happens, it has a very nice property which seems not to have been remarked earlier. But as it happens, the Kritcha index is nothing but the product of the standard deviation and the coefficient of variation. And if you think about it for a moment, the product of any relative measure of inequality, which is what the coefficient of variation is, with any absolute measure of inequality, which is what the standard deviation is, must yield you an intermediate index. This is because if you were to increase all incomes proportionately, the standard deviation part of this index would remain the same, but the coefficient of variation part would remain the same, but the standard deviation would increase, causing the aggregate index to increase. If you were to increase all incomes equally, the standard deviation would increase, but would decrease, but the I keep getting this wrong. You know what I mean, okay? All right. So, this is an index which satisfies all of these properties. So, the straightforward thing to do really to find out what's been happening to inequality in India would be to compute something like the Kritscha index. Incidentally, we have also done some work on intergroup inequalities for a categorization of the population according to caste and according to occupational divisions. And we find that those results which I mentioned earlier are verified at the level of groups as well. Now, let's take a look at, right. So for the years from 1983 to 2010, we have data on the standard deviation, which is an absolute measure, which, as you can see, is increasing vastly. But then, if I went to town on the strength of these results, I suppose Balla would have as much cause for complaint with me as I would have for complaint with him when he uses only relative measures. The coefficient of variation, which is the next index, gives you the time series with respect to the coefficient of variation, which has shown, if anything, only a mild increase. However, when you look at the Kritscha index, which is an intermediate measure, so what you're doing is you're not relying on an extreme absolute measure to deliver the results. Even with an intermediate measure, you find that the trend is a distinctly increasing one, which is particularly pronounced in the period from 2005 to 2010. Much of the work that we do on inequality is with respect to the Gini coefficient of inequality. If you look at the consumption expenditure Ginis, which is in the last column, in the last two columns, you will find that for the rural areas you have a rough constancy, and for the urban areas you have a slight increase. So people like Ahluwalia have basically rested their case on the time series trends which have been reflected by a measure such as the Gini coefficient, which is, however, completely inverted when you deal with an intermediate measure of inequality. Now, the figures are actually somewhat more dramatic for asset distribution. If you look at the distribution of household assets in India, we have these 10 points of data for which information is available from the surveys on debt and assets conducted by the Reserve Bank of India initially, and then subsequently by the National Sample Survey. So from 1962 to 2003, if you look at the Gini coefficients, which are the last column, they're roughly stationary for the rural areas, and they actually decline in the urban areas. But if you look at something like the Kritscha index, there's a uniform and continuous increase in the extent of measured inequality in the distribution of household assets. We don't have data here for the year 2011-12, the latest year for which data have just been released, but work done by my colleagues suggests that there has been a quantum leap in inequality in the last round of the NSS survey. So I'm afraid, well, that's it. The news on that front is not good. And that's essentially what I wanted to establish, because, I mean, there is a rumor abroad that inequality, apart from possibly being intrinsically not compatible with decent political morality, might also have instrumental disadvantages. It might promote conflict, that it could be very bad in particular for public health outcomes, which is a subject on which The Marmot report in the UK has dealt with at great and considerable and serious length that it would compromise efficiency. Now, surely these are matters on which we can have a debate, but I think it's a pity that that debate in India has been short-circuited. It's been preempted by the kinds of statistical analysis to which we have been subjected by people, dare I say, who should know better. So, and this is a problem not just with an assessment of inequality in India, but with the assessment of economic inequality either at the global level or with respect to other countries. It's only very recently that people like Atkinson and Bourguignon and a few others have been experimenting with non-relative measures of inequality to see if what they observe by using exclusively those kinds of inequality indices are actually reversed by protocols of measurement which are more reasonable. So that is a comment then in a way on what's wrong with economics as it's presently constituted, and then I will simply wind up with another quote on what might be done about it. In doing both of which, I'm actually going to quote a couple of people, not that I'm religiously inclined, but it just so happens that both of these people have had some engagement with religion. One is Marilyn Robinson, who says of economics that it is simply human traffic in what people make and do and value and need or think they need, a kind of epitome of civilization. It is the wealth of nations and also their fraudulence and malice and vainglory. It is no more reliably benign or rational than any other human undertaking. That is to say, it requires conscious choice and control, the making of moral and ethical judgments. And it's certainly true with respect to the protocols of measurement, but certainly much truer also in the larger domain of how we actually approach this problem. And the level of insensitivity which has mediated, especially the pink press's attitude towards these problems, beggars description. And nothing is improved by a contemplation of the moves which have been made, not least in the recent past, in the last 1 year or so, towards attending to India's economic problems. So, insensitivity, a somewhat more positive spin on this is placed by Karen Armstrong, who says, "We urgently need to make compassion a clear, luminous, and dynamic force in our polarized world. Rooted in a principled determination to transcend selfishness, compassion can break down political, dogmatic, ideological, and religious boundaries. Born of our deep interdependence, compassion is essential to human relationships and to a fulfilled humanity. It is the path to enlightenment and indispensable to the creation of a just economy and a peaceful global community." Thank you very much for your attention.
With this lecture of him, we would invite the House to now participate in, if there are any questions, any comments, we'll welcome that. And Mr. Subramanian is also here to participate further and answer those queries if there are any.
I'm hoping that somebody will tell me I've got it all wrong.
Thank you. That was a very interesting talk, and I'm still not clear what is not compassionate about either absolute or relative inequality.
Or what is not?
Compassionate about either absolute or relative inequality. They're measures. So they could be measuring that. Let me put it this way: the count, if the growth in inequality measured by some absolute measure had been higher than it was reported, then you would normatively say that was a bad thing. And therefore it follows that if it is not as high as it could have been, that is, it is what it is, then you can normatively say it's not a bad thing. And that is indeed how you measure all measures, right? I mean, relative inequality or absolute. So a merger of the two would need to have, merits other than saying that a particular measure does not allow one to make a judgment whether the consequence of inequality is, I'm thinking aloud a little bit, the complex talk. The consequence of inequality is better captured by, let's say, the K measure, I forget the full name like you, the too many consonants, than the measures we're used to using in economics, the absolute rest. Now, that is where I have a little difficulty, because, I mean, if I use the Gini coefficient, then I can say on the basis of that Gini coefficient that yes, a lower Gini coefficient is better than a higher one. You can say yes, but then it could still be the case that you could have a lower Gini coefficient, but a K that is higher. That would not invalidate the merit of saying that a lower Gini coefficient is better than a higher one. So I'd like your response to this. I'm not intending to ask this question. It's a fuzzy question. No one else is.
Thank you. Let me answer that straight away. It's a slight misunderstanding. I mean, I understand the spirit of your question, and I agree with everything that you said subsequently. In fact, it makes my job a little easier. But you see, my characterization in terms of compassion or the want of it was not with respect to the measures of inequality, but with respect to the attitude which many of us in our profession, at least, and certainly policymakers have towards the whole question of inequality. I mean, apparently we will only sit up and take note when a Stiglitz or a Piketty comes up with something, but be completely impervious to what's been happening under our noses, and indeed, even promote policies, again, most especially in the last year and a half, which are applauded. You know, relaxed labor laws, relaxed environmental laws, relaxed child labor laws, smart cities. I mean, these are the sorts of things which are happening with apparently no redeeming awareness of the fact, and this is where the second part of what you say comes in, of the fact that inequalities, judged from a reasonable perspective, have increased not just in a trend which is positive, but in some cases, and especially with respect to wealth, in an alarming fashion. So the protocols of measurement that we employ serves as an addendum to a certain naturally constituted insensitivity to these issues, and that's the point I was trying to.
Engaging talk. So this is more a conceptual question, and I'm broadly sympathetic to the sort of normative position you're taking. But in some of the debates that you referred to, I always have this sort of puzzle that should we be focusing on bottom tail deprivation as opposed to some overall sense of inequality? Is it the fact that somebody's building a 7,000 crore house that's bothering us, but the juxtaposition of that with extreme deprivation? And if you had any sort of reaction to that, because poverty or deprivation, I can see the ethical case right away, but some of the debates could be, what is the problem if in the growth process some people are doing well?
I'm deeply sympathetic to what you say. Much of this effort is actually, as you will have probably already inferred, of a polemical nature. So one does what one can in one's capacity. So it's in that sense that but yes, at a practical and at a conceptual level, bottom end deprivation is what is really interesting. So the growth story in India has been mediated by two pronouncements. One, that it's been inclusive, or at least not necessarily exclusive. And the second, that it has been accompanied by dramatic declines in poverty. That's the other scandal. But as Kipling would say, that's another story. But vis-a-vis that, very quickly, I think the protocols of measurement when it comes to money-metric poverty assessment are as deeply suspect in a completely different way as are the protocols of measurement in the context of inequality. And I think a simple way of dealing with this problem is to employ what a philosopher would call a money-metric index simpliciter, a straightforward, simple index which conforms with what Kaushik Basu used to call the quintile income statistic. Just take a look at the average income of the poorest 20% of a population and track that over time, but with the reference to reasonably targeted levels at the rates at which they must grow. And you will immediately find that if you did this either for the Indian economy or for the global economy, then all the nice stories that you can tell with this conceptually arid, not to say completely meaningless, dollar a day kinds of calculations just go out of the window. And I think really that's where we ought to be concentrating our attentions on. Honestly and straightforwardly admit that when we are looking at the average income of the poorest 20% of the population, we are treating income as an end in itself and not stylishly as a means to an end, where you get everything addled up by combining assessments and functionings or capability space with assessments and income space and getting everything wrong in the process. So I think there's a case for being simple-minded about this and seeing where that leads you. And I think where it will lead you is to more bad news on the poverty front as
Sir, my name is Manish and I'm a research scholar. Sir, while answering the first question, you said that in the past 1.5 years, the government has shown initiative towards liberalizing labor laws and etc. etc. One of the reasons cited by the scholars you named while you were giving your lecture, Professor Jagdish Bhagwati and Arvind Panagaria, they maintain that the East Asian nations were able to take off in labor-intensive manufacturing right since the 70s and created so many jobs. Was this particular reason that they had a very flexible labor law regime, which we didn't have in India? We have very restrictive labor laws. So what is your take on that? Second, well, I haven't completed reading Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century and Professor Atkinson's inequality book released just 1 or 2 months back. But I find that both these authors maintain that inequality has gone up in the past 3 or 4 decades itself. So by the time Thatcher and the Reagan Revolution starts taking place in Britain and America. So don't you feel that their work somehow has ideological overtones? Does, or given you're a scholar of a great repute, was inequality before 1980, because you start showing data from 1980 to 2023, if I heard you correctly. The first 3 decades, we had an average income growth of just 3.5%. So for somebody like me, it becomes difficult to understand when you don't have enough growth, you don't have enough opportunities. Maybe in the past 2 or 3 decades, we had enough growth, we have enough opportunities, but at the same time, the inequality level is rising, which is definitely a matter of concern. Your take on that? Thank you.
First question drew some reference to the last 1.5 years and to Arvind Panagaria. Yeah. You see, my data goes back to 1983. So I mean, I'm describing a long-term secular trend. What I did say was, not least in the last 1.5 years in terms of policies. Because if this has been happening over the last 30 years, then one would expect that there should be some course correction. And what I'm seeing is a bunch of policies which might be expected to exacerbate and not to mitigate these circumstances. As for what Arvind Panagaria says, well, he's responsible for what he says. He also seems to believe, among other things, that undernutrition is not a serious problem in India, but I should find it very difficult to defend Panagaria from himself. So I will pass on that question. What was the second question?
Just please come again.
The second question
Part
was,
2 of your question.
It was related to the inequality. Actually, I was saying that both Atkinson and Thomas Piketty, they refer to the period of past 30 years or so. By the time the Thatcher and the Reagan Revolution takes place in US and UK. So I was asking, don't you feel that this the whole emphasis on inequality which has gained in the past few decades has something to do with ideological overtones? Does it have ideological overtones?
Does it have ideological overtones?
Does what have ideological overtones?
Inequality.
Does the issue of inequality have ideological overtones? Is that your question? Of course it does.
Well,
No, but can I just... Okay,
I'm very sorry about this. I mean, if anybody who had picked it up, if they can just relay it, you know.
Sorry, I think just to paraphrase or summarize the question, the recent two best-selling books by Piketty and Atkinson, the Atkinson one just came out, both of them have focused on increasing inequality, but I'm quoting him, since this seems to be starting from the 80s, which is the start of the Reagan-Thatcher era, isn't this sort of whole discussion ideologically biased? That's the question.
Okay. Well, I agree with the antecedents of your questions, but I'm not sure that the consequent follows. I mean, yes, the Thatcher-Reagan regime and everything that went with it, and which it has subsequently engendered, can scarcely be accused of wanting an ideological bias. Certainly, yes. It was. All of this was inspired by a certain view of the world, which I personally find distasteful, to say the least. Yes. So yes, and if economists are finally owning up to the possibility that they might actually have values which are motivating the kinds of noises that they make, why? I think that's a good thing.
Well, very quick, two meteorological questions. So very interesting data. All your indices and the results are, well, taking into account the poorest quintile and the richest quintile, isn't it? So that was one clarificatory question. And secondly, like, well, one of your answer you yourself mentioned about like what's happening to the bottom 20% over the year. So you have the interesting consumption data for like, let's, from starting from 83. Take out the richest quintile. Can you like just tell us what is happening to, let's say, in absolute number to the poorest quintile over the years?
Yeah. Those graphs which I showed you had reference only to the contrast between the richest and the poorest quintiles. I agree. So I was only concentrating at the two polar ends. And that is in the tradition of the so-called PAMA indices of inequality. But if it is generally believed to be the case that in order to get a more complete picture of inequality, what you ought to be doing is to look at the entire distribution rather than only at the tails, then I have attended to that by presenting the values of the Kirchhoff Intermediate Index, which holds for the distribution as a whole. That's not only for the, all of those indices which you find in that table refer to the entire distribution. Refer to the entire distribution. Your second question was on what's been happening to the poorest 20%. Yes, you see, if you use the poverty lines, which the official poverty lines, then you get a nice, pleasing trend decline in the headcount ratio of poverty. Using what is substantially the same methodology which the Planning Commission, and which indeed is only a variant of the methodology which the World Bank employs, Utsa Patnaik, by simply changing the reference year, okay, although she doesn't put it in those terms, but this is what she does. By simply changing the reference years, she gets an increasing trend of headcount ratios. Now, I think even, now the point is this, neither of these methods is defensible. But for polemical reasons, it's always used to make use, to exploit the philosophical dictum that what is sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. So if the one methodology is permissible, so is the other. So you can make equally plausible or implausible assertions about what's been happening to money metric poverty on the basis of the methodologies which have been employed for cracking what is called the identification problem in the measurement of poverty, namely to fix the poverty line. So one way of getting out of this problem is not to use a poverty line at all, because what you typically tend to do is to fix a poverty line and then you find the proportion of the population below it. You simply invert the procedure here. You fix the proportion of the population in poverty, say the poorest 20%, and then you just take a look at what has been happening to the average income of the poorest 20%. That has obviously increased, which is why I find Utsa Patnaik's own work on money-metric poverty, namely that it's been increasing, to be highly implausible. Because even casual empiricism will tell you that poverty has certainly declined in India, however you might measure it. The only question is, has it declined as dramatically as it's been made out to be, which enables you then to pursue your neoliberal policies with a complete want of any compunction. That's the issue. But if you look at the average income of the poorest 20%, again, that's been increasing over time. But the Hindu rate of growth has come in for so much criticism, and we will now settle for nothing less than a 10% compound annual rate of growth for per capita national income. Now, for reasons of consistency, shouldn't we also have some such target for the average income of the poorest 20%? And if you pitch that modestly at 3% per annum, and then work out the warranted levels of consumption expenditure, which would obtain if the 3% rate of growth were to be adhered to, and if you took the ratio of the actual levels of consumption expenditure to the warranted levels of consumption expenditure, you get a systematically declining trend. So that's again not very good news.
Sir, Mr. Mukherjee, sir, would you like to comment, sir?
Hi, thank you for the great talk. Yeah, so I was just curious if you could speak a little more about maybe perhaps the causes of the inequality that you are propounding. It seems also, for example, often we hear that politics and economics are very closely linked, and over the course that you've described, maybe if you do the same exercise for perhaps constructing these political Lorenz curves, we might find that political inequality in that was actually quite substantially decreased over time with affirmative action policies. So then how does one reconcile the two facts that, on one hand you have political inequality reducing substantially with the rise of the backward classes, but on the other hand, perhaps, the similar sort of increases or the similar sort of decreases in inequality have not been seen in the economic sphere. Your thoughts on that?
Okay. Yes, I spoke only of economic inequality, and even there, I didn't even speak about employment, for example. I only spoke about money metric inequality in the spaces of consumption expenditure and household wealth. So it was a very limited exercise. But first, to take your second question first. Yes, political inequalities have declined, just as poverty has declined, just as the infant mortality rate has declined, just as the expectation of age at birth has increased. Now, I would say that what calls for comment is not these beneficent trends. You must take that for granted. For a country which has emerged from colonialism, and given the fact that we are living in a modern era, what would be particularly noteworthy is if there was an actual deterioration in many of these indicators. So the fact that there have been improvements is not in itself, in my view, particularly remarkable or not noteworthy. What, however, is remarkable is whether these improvements conform to what you might judge to be the potential of this country, conform to what's been happening in comparably backward countries, and whether they conform to absolutely acceptable levels for these industries. To say that reservation has played a certain role in improving the lot of the backward caste is absolutely true, and one is very pleased to register that fact. But what is also seriously disheartening is that something like Kairlanji can still happen in this country with little or no note being taken of it. Every day you have something like 77 cases of assault against scheduled caste, scheduled tribe women. Okay? So the fact that things have improved, or yes, I will grant that we have made the transition from the truly terrible to the merely awful. But I think that is all that we can claim credit. The other question was on the roots of inequality. Well, if you're talking about economic inequality, it is my view that India is an undertaxed country. I think there is no alternative, if you're thinking of mitigating inequality, to a redistributive taxation of one type or the other, which means enhanced public spending on welfare measures properly conceived. So I think we should be, instead of speaking about scrapping the public distribution system and replacing it with a targeted cash transfer system, I think what we should be doing is strengthening the public distribution system, increasing our outlays on health and education, improving delivery on these, and raising the resources for it, and that must be through taxation. We have abolished instead the wealth tax. Rathin tells me that the unaccounted income level in India is 70% of the accounted GDP, and this has been available in a report which was submitted as far as back as December 2013 to the Government of India. So some back of the envelope calculations which I have done on a guaranteed minimum income of 3,000 rupees for a family of 5 suggests that it calls for very little incremental effort to be able to. So yes, and the other major cause, as I see it, is what has been viewed as a very good development in India, especially by those theorists who sought to explain India's enhanced growth performance in recent years. That is a business-friendly environment. So if you look at the Business India annual publications on the wealth holdings of the top 300 business houses, and if you were to seek to integrate that with official NSSO data on, then the wealth statistics, the inequality statistics on wealth become just explosive. It's not at all clear to me that we can possibly afford, I mean, I'm not talking about the intrinsic moral questions which are involved here, but from the point of view of enlightened self-interest, whether this country can continue to afford these massive levels of inequality fostered by accumulation.
Okay, I guess with this we are coming to end of this session. Thank you so much for enlightening us. It was very, very thought-provoking. Initially, it was little kind of, I mean, people were not very keen to participate initially. Once it started, and after that there were plenty of questions, and it was a very good session. And thank you all. We will move on to the next session. Thank you.
To the land market there, right? You're taking off a chunk of land, and basic demand supply tells us that they should drive up the price.